Welcome to episode 2 of Just the Facts with me, the Watergate girl, Jill Wine-Banks. I have believed all my life that facts matter, and I will be bringing you weekly guests to talk about the facts and just the facts in their areas of expertise. Last week, I talked to Sue Craig, the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, about the lucky loser, Donald Trump, and all of his false illusions that he has created. And this week, I'm talking to Michele Goodwin. Her credentials are so extensive that I'm going to have to put them in the show notes so that you can see them. But you, I'm sure, have seen her on MSNBC and other networks. You probably know who she is, but she is an expert in reproductive freedoms. She's a professor now at Georgetown. She was at the University of California at Irvine. And she is absolutely a great communicator who can fill you in on things. We're going to be talking about Melania Trump's recent coming forward in support of abortion, something I personally think is a fraud and intended to fool voters. We'll also be talking about the Georgia decision to ban abortions at 6 weeks, which was overturned by a Fulton County judge and reinstated by the Georgia Supreme Court, now headed to the Supreme Court, I am sure, and a little bit about the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, which was thrown out and then reinstated in Texas, and then the Supreme Court has refused to take it up until it goes through the normal procedures of an appeal. So welcome, Michele. We're delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you, Jill. It's a pleasure to be with you.
There are so many exciting topics that I want to talk to you about. But the first one I want to start with is a new video of Melania Trump, the woman who wore a coat saying, "I don't really care, do you?" at a very inappropriate time, is now caring about women's reproductive health. Maybe. I'm not sure, because it's certainly completely contrary to what her husband feels and to Project 25, which is, of course, something her husband will follow. So I'm just going to read you a sentence from it, and then I want you to talk about this. Melania says in black and white with dramatic music, "Individual freedom is a fundamental principle that I safeguard." Oh, yeah. How? I don't know. "Without a doubt," she says, "there is no room for compromise when it comes to this essential right that all women possess from birth, individual freedom. What does my body, my choice really mean?" she asks. So, Michele, when Melania Trump says that, what does it mean? Is this pure political pandering or what?
Jill, we don't know. So it comes at a time in which it's years after her husband has set into motion what has been a space of legal chaos, moral disregard, pain and suffering, like we haven't seen in ways that are decades old, decades going back to Jim Crow and before that. And I'm not exaggerating here, conditions that we found during a period of American enslavement where women were forced to carry pregnancies that they did not want. And so he has been very visible in having articulated that he wanted to criminally punish women who wanted to have abortions. He walked that back slightly and then said that he wanted and would put on the Supreme Court justices that would overturn Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and that he would also do the same at the district court level. After having done that at the Supreme Court level, he has taken credit for those in the majority, those new 3 justices, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. He's taken credit for those people being placed on the court to do what he said he wanted them to do and what they understood as the message to be done. Now, whether they are resistant to that messaging, whether they want to disavow it or be distanced from it, we don't know, because we've not heard that. We've not heard from Justices Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Barrett that Donald Trump should stop saying these things and that they are not bought spokespersons for the former president. And so what you're asking is a question that's come in that kind of aftermath. And I want to just lay out a little bit more of that aftermath because I think it gives texture, context to the moment that we're in immediately following the Dobbs decision, of which Justices Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett signed on, which did overturn Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey. We saw a 10-year-old girl having to escape from one state, Ohio, to get to another state, Indiana, in order to terminate a pregnancy that was caused by rape. We saw the disarray at the state legislative level, where in the state of Ohio, legislators said at first it was a hoax, and then they claimed that their law provided exceptions for cases like this, which clearly they hadn't read their own law because it didn't. And so in that space, that was just the beginning. That was the beginning. And so since then, we've seen Amanda Zorowski, Kate Cox, Brittany Watts. I mean, we could just go through the plethora of names from Louisiana to Texas to Alabama
Georgia.
and Wisconsin,
Georgia.
all over Georgia, death.
Yeah, exactly. So
Idaho,
let's not
women being
underestimate that.
helicoptered.
I think it's very important to say that this has led to death. And will continue to, and we're going to talk more about Georgia, but let's
and this
stick
kind of
with
suffering.
what Melania means.
That's right.
I want to just,
that's right.
Is this just, she's got a book coming out tomorrow. And is
she wants
this
to sell
just
that
part
book. She's part of a family that's used to selling things, right? They sell a lot of things, watches, sneakers, Bibles now, coins that are not real bronze, not real gold, plated. So they're used to selling. So look, your question, and I'm taking it seriously. I just wanted to give some context. So you asked, is this expedient coming out now, or is this sincere? I don't know. Here's one thing. Donald Trump probably prior to running for president, as he had said that he would run for president under a Republican ticket because he said that people who vote for Republicans are perhaps not that smart, not my words, his words.
Yes.
And so maybe he had a different position before running. Maybe he truly deep down in his heart actually supports abortions. Maybe he does, but politically he does not. And it's political, which is winning now. And so for Melania, we don't know. But it certainly does mean that as Republicans have been losing on this point in state after state with ballot initiatives, this perhaps is an intervention a month before an election that may be thought of as perhaps helping Republicans.
So,
I don't know.
I'm going to say two things. One,
say it, Jill.
My guess is that she doesn't believe it, or that if she does, it's totally irrelevant, that it will have no impact on her husband. And when she says, I will safeguard, that is such nonsense. If she was going to safeguard, she would have stopped him a long time ago.
And she can't. She doesn't have that power.
Of course she doesn't. Well, first of all, she's not even on the campaign trail.
No, she's not.
This is ridiculous for her to be saying it.
Except she's selling books.
Well, okay, but that's a different thing. She's selling books. And the other thing that I want to say is, I don't think it's going to work, because he may have said that people who vote Republican are stupid, but I don't think they all are stupid. I don't think women are stupid. I don't think evangelicals are stupid. So is this going to help him with evangelicals, that his wife is saying, I'm for abortion? No. It's going to help him with the undecideds? They can't be that stupid.
No, it's not going to help. Well, look, even at the Republican National Convention and the platform, there were Republicans that were offended by the platform not having a quote unquote pro-life message. I don't use the term pro-life except in, air quotes and saying it like that, because I see it more as an anti-abortion stance. But those who see themselves as pro-life and who had counted on being part of the platform, that language, were very concerned and upset about that being stripped away from the platform. And again, perhaps that was in response to Project 2025 and the fact that Americans have become deeply aggrieved and concerned about what's happened since the Supreme Court has overturned Roe v. Wade.
Well, they're seeing the death, they're seeing the problems, and it's starting to affect a lot of people. But you use some words that I just want to talk about, because words matter. And saying pro-life pro-choice are sort of old-fashioned words. We want to talk about reproductive health care,
Yes.
which is what this is part of.
That's right.
We want to talk about, no one wants to choose abortion. No one wants to choose that they will not have IVF or they will not have contraception, which is all related to this. People want to have freedoms to make their own decisions and not to have the government interfere. I'm actually wearing a Jill's pin today that I just got. I was in Wisconsin canvassing voters, and the Walworth County Democratic Party gave me a pin that says, "Mind your own damn business."
My goodness. Jill, have you spent a lot of time in Wisconsin? Do you have roots in Wisconsin? You said Wisconsin like Wisconsin people say Wisconsin.
Well, I have gone there a lot, and I have my goddaughter lives there, who's one of my favorite people. And I was with a friend.
This in you.
Yeah. Well, of course, you can notice my flat
But terminology
A's.
and linguistics, right? You mentioned that. And words do matter. They absolutely do. So, for example, one aspect of the broader question that deserves far more attention, but sadly receives very little, is the violence that's been associated with the anti-abortion movement that calls itself pro-life. Since the time of Roe v. Wade, nearly 50 clinics bombed in the United States, doctors murdered at their homes, murdered at their churches, mowed over, clinics set afire with people inside, gunmen coming to clinics and shooting them up, threats against doctors. I know doctors who are very, very caring. They want to help their patients and serve their patients, and they refuse to be caught on video or camera. They'll speak at a conference, but they're very clear. You cannot take their picture. You cannot post video of them. I have convened meetings with doctors where afterwards having to work with the video engineers to extract their image and just put a black box there. And they tell me why? Because they have children and they don't want someone showing up at their home and killing their children. And those are not extreme. They're not extremist in their concerns. They have this concern because of this living history that we don't talk about, that is real and that is today. And it's not something that we can cabin to, oh, that happened in 1973 or that was 1972. These are real life threats that continue to this day.
And when they say pro-life, as they will continue to do, pro-life in utero, not after birth. They don't care. They won't take care of. They won't fund. They don't care about, let's talk about childcare and Donald Trump's answer to the New York Economic Club, which was gibberish. So anyway, let's move to the Georgia case.
Yes.
I'm sort of, it's hard to know where to start in that case because as of 5 o'clock today, which is about, 2 hours from now, the law has flipped back. Judge McBurney said it's an unconstitutional law that says no abortions after 6 weeks in Georgia. But the Georgia Supreme Court has said as of 5 o'clock today, you can enforce the 6-week ban. So we're back to that for the second time. This is not the first time it's happened. One of the most exciting things about the decision is two things. One, as Ruth Marcus said, even though she recognized, and this was several days ago, she said, even though it's going to be short-lived, and this one lasted 7 days, I think, whereas the last time it was thrown out, it lasted 8 days. So women in Georgia, if you have an abortion scheduled for sometime before 5 o'clock today, fine. If it's after 5, you can't have it. But he wrote such great language, Judge McBurney. And so I do want to go into some of it, but I'm going to start with the fact that you are cited in his decision in reference to let's maybe for our listeners, if we could start with, you tell me the basis of his decision to throw it out, and then talk about the 13th Amendment and the enslavement of women, enforcing them to carry to term things that cannot survive outside of them at a point where they can't survive. He has no problem if you wait until it is viable outside the woman's body. But until then, he says that's
right.
enslavement. But you tell our listeners.
Let me tell you about that argument, right? Because it's an important argument, and it's an argument that I think we will see more in these cases, and it's long overdue. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. And it is the first of the Reconstruction Amendments. That second Reconstruction Amendment is the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is cited by the Supreme Court in the Dobbs decision, where the Supreme Court says that it's looked back at history. It's found nothing in history that would suggest protecting one against would protect one's ability to be able to terminate a pregnancy or to protect someone against being forced to carry a pregnancy to term. And if we understand the 13th Amendment and the historical conditions around it, we know that very specifically the abolitionists, the leading argument being made by abolitionists in that time, specifically related to reproductive servitude. Many Americans tend to think of slavery as the bucolic fields where people were picking these damp balls of cotton or maybe fluffy balls of cotton, and they understand it was wrong because people didn't get paid. But that's about it in terms of the American imagination. Maybe people extended to understanding that, yes, people didn't live in the best housing conditions. In some places around the country now, they're calling them immigrant quarters, right? Trying to reframe what it was, the kinds of shacks that enslaved people were subjected to. But if you really unpack history and you read across what the framers of the 13th Amendment were writing about, what they were giving speeches on, and they were giving speeches all across the country and in Europe and whatnot. And the key issue was reproductive slavery, reproductive servitude, involuntary reproductive servitude. And if you think about it, if you're an abolitionist, and these were the people who were able to win their seats in Congress, they were the radical Republicans who launched the 13th Amendment and had it ratified. I mean, who were these people that were writing it? Which is another thing that people have a disconnect about, right? This didn't come from people who won this, who lost the Civil War. Those were not the people who were in Congress. The people who were in Congress were people who supported freedom. And so out of that came this 13th Amendment. And what they wrote about, Jill, and maybe I'll center around Senator Sumner, because he was beaten nearly to death in the halls of Congress 3 days after having given a speech about Black girls and women being forced into involuntary reproductive servitude. And he called it rape, this speech. And it was a printed document and it had rape across it. So why did he get beaten up? And who tried to beat him up? And why do we then have a 13th Amendment that pays attention to this? Well, it was a representative, Prescott, who was from South Carolina, who was a person who was a slave owner. And he was deeply offended by Charles Sumner going around the country talking about the raping of Black girls and women, which was true. And Charles Sumner was saying that it was a violation of human rights, of human dignity, of the Constitution, all those different things. And he was so bludgeoned with a cane in Congress that he had to leave office for 3 years.
I did not know that part of the story. I knew that women were raped and forced to carry the babies to term. And that is the very definition of involuntary servitude. And actually, Judge McBurney even says, in addition to that, he says, you wouldn't expect a woman to be forced, or any person, which is more important, any person, to be forced to donate a kidney or tissue to someone else. Why would you expect them to be forced to endure the pain and suffering of an unwanted pregnancy? And let me just read part of what the court said, because it's the part about you. So sorry, viewers, I'm going to have to look at my screen to read this. While the court does not find that the Life Act, which is the Georgia Act, violates the state and federal constitutional prohibitions against involuntary servitude, citing the Georgia Constitution, it is important to acknowledge the degree to which such laws compel a subset of our society to, against their will, labor for what the legislature has decided is the betterment of society. This is eerily reminiscent of an earlier times about which insufficient discussion is had when reviewing the, quote, history, unquote, of laws surrounding reproductive rights in the United States. See Michele Goodwin, Involuntary Reproductive Servitude, Forced Pregnancy, Abortion, and the 13th Amendment. You wrote it in 2022, the University of Chicago Legal Forum, 191, 2022. And we'll try to put a link on our website for that so that people can
Thank you.
look at your very cogent argument.
Thank you. Jill, I want to make another point that connects to what he was lifting up, this notion of the betterment for society.
Yes.
Jill, this was the argument that was put before the Supreme Court in 1927 when the court in Buck v. Bell upheld Virginia's model sterilization law, its model eugenics law. And just so that we're clear here and we don't go down that road that Justice Thomas wants to pave for us, where he claims that abortion is eugenics and this eugenics was against Black women. 1927, this had nothing to do with Black folks. The United States was trying to figure out what it was going to do with poor white people. And this is a real tragedy. I mean, we know the racial piece to this and white supremacy, but the piece that has been hidden where Americans look over at Germany and say, oh, you Germans, look at what you did. That was so awful. And it was awful. But what Americans don't know is that we started that in the U.S. It was a campaign against poor white people, and it was framed as eugenics. And in the 1927 case, Buck v. Bell, which involved a poor white girl who at 16 years old had been raped by her employer's nephew and had a baby out of wedlock, the state of Virginia had found that people like Carrie Buck, who were poor and white, needed sterilization because it was better for the state of Virginia and other states that they not be allowed to reproduce. And when you think about it, this campaign of eugenics, weaning out a whole category of people. There was nothing wrong with Carrie except that she was poor and she was white. And that was it. And I think it's hard for us to imagine, given the arc of white supremacy in our country, it's hard to actually imagine that in the 1920s, there was an effort to wipe away an entire category of people. And they were not Black. They were poor white people. And so as he's referencing as well, you know, for the betterment of society, this was exactly the argument that Virginia made and the argument that was articulated by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, that this is better for society. Let's get rid of them. In fact, he says, better than to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those that are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. It's the conflation that if you're poor and white, this makes you an imbecile. And this also makes it such that we shouldn't have to spend money on you. You're manifestly unfit to live in the United States. That's harsh. And it's not my words. It's read the case. This is what the U.S. Supreme Court says.
Oh, speaking of the Supreme Court, this has already been overturned by the Georgia Supreme Court. And so the law is back in effect, and death will result, and suffering will result, unfairness will result. And what's going to happen in terms of how fast will it get to the Supreme Court? And given that the Supreme Court must see how unpopular this position is there any chance that they're going to moderate their view, or are they going to just say, we're gone?
Well, this is where the Chief Justice, John Roberts, has talked about balls and strikes. He's not the only one, but, you know, in modern times, right, it's where do you have the votes? And we've seen a doubling down among certain jurists on the court, a doubling down by Justice Alito after the leaked opinion. It seemed to have not made much of a difference. We see the doubling down with those that were in the majority with him. The one person that seemed to possibly, you know, moderated this and supposedly Justice Roberts had hoped for a different outcome. I mean, we don't know. This is all behind the scenes talk. You know, did he really try to win some of the conservatives over to a different position? Because Mississippi's first law was a 15-week abortion ban. It wasn't get rid of Roe v. Wade altogether. right? And so if the court had come out with a 15-week ban, which still means suffering, because you can have a miscarriage in your 20th week, your 22nd week, right? So it still would have been something that would have caused suffering, but you see a doubling down, which was, let's just get rid of Roe altogether. And in fact, as we do so, let's cite these jurists who believed in women as marital property, who had no problem with and in fact espoused marital rape as being something legitimate, who saw no position for women to defend themselves against domestic violence. And it's these scholars that Justice Alito cites in a decision that is taking away, stripping women of medical autonomy. So this
It's more
court,
than that, though, because for women my age, and so I'm really addressing this to the younger listeners today or viewers today, women my age know that we were considered chattel. We could not, when I was in law school, I couldn't get my own credit card without my husband's okay. Guys, think about what that means, how unfree we were. And I think that younger viewers don't really realize
I
how
think that that's
far
right.
backwards we are headed. And I wonder, Michele, do you think the Equal Rights Amendment, which is one of my current passions, I really want to see President Biden as his last act as president to order the archivist to publish the Equal Rights Amendment. I believe it has met all the qualifications it needs to be, the 28th Amendment, and he should order it. And failing that, that President Harris should make it her first point of business. But do you think that if it is the 28th Amendment, that the Equal Rights Amendment would make a difference in the outcome of these cases?
Potentially it would, because as you were noting, there was a Jane Crow. There still is a Jane
Yes.
Crow now, which denied women myriad rights. When Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, it was noted that during her time as a lawyer and defending against and seeking to strike down these sex discriminatory laws, that there were over 600 that fell.
Yes.
Imagine that. We could go down the laundry list of those. And so the power behind an equal rights amendment is to establish then a constitutional liberty, a civil right, a civil liberty that relates to the whole being of a woman and that denies discrimination based on sex. And it has been woven into the fabric of American legislation and also jurisprudence, this discrimination against women, separating women from themselves, quite specifically within law. So here's one note
Yeah.
that we both know. In law school, in your torts class, there is a principle called loss of consortium, and loss
Yes.
of consortium was specifically made in
Yeah.
law. If a woman had been in a car accident or in a accident with
Yes.
a horse running her over, she doesn't get to sue. It's her husband who gets to sue because someone has taken his property away from him,
Yes.
has diminished his property, including sex. Right?
Yes.
That he gets to recover because she's no longer sexually available to him. He gets to recover because she can't make pancakes for
Yeah.
the kids. He gets to recover because
Yeah.
she's not cleaning up the house well enough, and you can't make that up.
No, you can't. And that is maybe the title of this episode because it's so outrageous. And I want people to know all these facts and why we need the Equal Rights Amendment. And, going back to what's going to happen at the Supreme Court, which is, of course, who can predict a outcome of a court that has totally thrown away precedent. They just do what they want to do. They say they're textualists. They say they're originalists. That is such baloney because if it's convenient to the outcome, they ignore the actual language of a statute or of the Constitution. I mean, you go to the Second Amendment and talk about for a militia. Oh, that doesn't matter. We're going to skip those words. So I hate to predict, but I am wondering today, just minutes ago, and so you may not have seen it yet, the court refused to take up the Texas EMTALA law, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, which requires that any hospital that has an emergency room and that gets federal funding must provide stabilizing care to anyone in need. And that can, in many situations, maybe not many, but in some situations, require that what might be called an abortion be performed to save the life of the mother or the health of the mother. And Texas is refusing that and passed a law saying, no, we're not doing that. And the Supreme Court is not taking it up. It's going to let it stay in effect until the lower courts deal with it. So I don't know. Do you think that is unfortunately a predictor of what they might do with the Georgia case when it gets there?
Look, I don't say this lightly. I don't. But it's become a killing court in that way. I don't say that lightly. But keep in mind that the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act was specifically designed to respond to the crises that women had while in labor, while pregnant. And it was expansive. It starts with women, but it affects us all. So none of us should be turned
Yeah.
away from a hospital if we've got a broken leg, if we've whatever the ailment, we have a heart attack and we don't have insurance. You can't be turned away. You can't be dumped. You must
Yeah.
be treated. You must be stabilized. Right? It's specifically
Yeah.
in the law. We have in Republican administrations, that was during a Republican administration. And then
Yes.
we had later in Republican administrations, the Bush administration, that this included abortion care when it was necessary. So not new.
Yeah.
Republican administrations, this is understood that this can include abortion. And here we are with in Idaho, women having to be airlifted out of the state in order to get the care that they need. You see the direct showdown against 200 years of judicial principle, which is that federal law trumps states' laws. We've understood this since it's law school 101.
It
So
is
your
indeed.
very first law school class in constitutional
Yeah.
law, you're learning this, right? The first weeks you are understanding the establishment of power and authority. And for the sake of undermining the health and safety, the civil liberties and civil rights of women, you then see the expedience of turning the other way on 200 years of precedent. And that's a real tragedy for our democracy. And that tragedy for our democracy has real life, real world effects for women and girls in this country right now, including one of those real world effects being the potential for death and actual death. That is what we have seen, that level of irresponsibility that has come. And even this summer with the Supreme Court and its Intala ruling, giving a procedural response rather than a substantive response, where the court substantively could have spoken to, this is what EMTALA was designed for. This is what it's meant for. We don't have to study archives that are 200 or 300 years old. In fact, they're very recent decades. Here's what Congress said at the time. Here's what prior administrations did at the time. But again, this is a court that has chosen to be opportunistic in how it reads history and in how it has at least addressed these questions of democracy for women, which I would argue affects us all. And these are not just questions about women. These are questions that will reach men too. These are questions that reach populations, that folks who are LGBTQ. And we can see this coming up very closely now on matters involving individuals that are trans.
Yeah, we're going to have to talk about the LGBTQ case that the court is now going to be hearing. I don't want to end on a depressing note. And let me just say, first of all, that we have a chance to change this, because in less than 1 month, we will have a new president. We may not know in exactly less than a month because of some of the things the Republicans are doing to require hand counting of ballots and things. But I am hoping that if everyone listening to this takes us seriously and takes the danger that the Supreme Court poses, you cannot let Donald Trump appoint any more justices to the Supreme Court or to the district court or to the courts of appeals throughout our country. So please, everyone, take heart and vote blue. Please, please, please. It's really important. And this show promises you just the facts, and we're getting them from experts in every field. And today we were lucky to have with us And I'm hoping she will come back because we certainly didn't finish this conversation, but you have to teach a class. So I'm going to have to let you go to teach, but I hope you'll come back because you are the kind of expert we want our viewers to see and take heart from. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be with you, Jill.